Hi again then guys, and of course welcome to the first car review from GT Sport 1.53, and as I mentioned yesterday in my full review of the update, I will be starting with my favourite car of the pack, a car which, as I said then, I've been talking about for a long time on the channel. It's not one of my favourite cars in real life, but in games it's a really good machine. It's already great in this game, it's great in Forza, it's great wherever it shows up, and that is the Ford GT. But, in particular, of course, this is the latest Ford GT. Well, kind of. There is a more hardcore version on the way, but in terms of the regular production street versions, this is the newest one we have. Now, of course, the engine is totally different to before. The last generation was a 5.4 litre supercharged V8. This one is a 3.5 litre turbo-aspirated V6, so completely different EcoBoost technology, which I have no problem with. Whatever works, you know, whatever makes it a good car, and clearly on this occasion it does, because despite being a much more modern take on a supercar than the 2005, for instance, GT is, it still feels pretty raw and also sufficiently updated to keep up with the current climate of McLarens and Ferraris and all that kind of stuff. So with all of that in mind, what spec does this car have? Well, again, it's got that 3.5 litre engine, of course, 646 horsepower stock, 550 pound-feet of torque, so both very healthy there. The weight is very good. 1,385 kilos gives you plenty to work with, not just stock, but also of course if you drop the weight as well. And the price tag I think is perfect for what it is. It's 550 grand, which is right where I expected it to be. I thought somewhere between 400 and 600,000. And in terms of what this car can actually do, well, it offers a lot straight off the bat. Now, I've heard some people say that they find it to be maybe a little bit understeery in its stock form, a little bit heavy through corners. I can definitely feel what you mean, especially over the front end, but at the same time, just knowing how to use it is half the battle, and then tuning it, of course, makes all the difference as well. Now, speaking of that tuning, one of the main things that you're probably wondering is how fast and how powerful can this thing be? Because of course the Ford GT is already great. It's actually one of the quicker supercars that we have in GT Sport in a straight line in particular, but the Ford GT is never actually all that powerful in Gran Turismo. You're looking at, what, 940 horsepower, something like that in its pinnacle in GT6, more like 840 now. This one is similar, funnily enough. It's about 840 horsepower fully tuned, so not as impressive as you might be hoping, but at the same time, what it can do with that is very impressive. Now, to be clear, I have not done a specific speed tune, if you will, for this car yet, but it would not surprise me in the slightest if it can easily exceed 260, maybe even 270. Now, sometimes the cars aren't as quick as that. The SLR McLaren, for instance, was a little underwhelming, but then again, so was the power in comparison to what it used to be. This one, though, I still have good hopes for, and again, the other Ford GT has a similar amount of power and is still very quick. Now, in terms of handling, as I said, some people have issues with it. I personally like it. It handles, I think, as it should. It's certainly consistent through Gran Turismo and Forza, so they must be getting it fairly accurate if it feels similar in both games. And in terms of how competitive it can be, well, the range is great. Of course, N800 is the upper level, and you can even detune it to around N400, which is very impressive. And even in the event that I'm doing here, I'm up against N1000 cars, and of course the AI isn't the fastest thing around, especially on Laguna Seca, but it does go to show just how quick this thing is. And most of the cars that I tune and I race tend to be the kind of machine where they're not quite as quick on the straights. You'll see, for instance, this afternoon when I review the Porsche Carrera RS on this same track, I put that one up against Group 4 cars, and it's not as quick on the straights, but through the corners, you can make up some time. With the GT, on the other hand, it's not so much the complete opposite, but it kind of feels like it, because it's so quick on the straights that you don't really need to make up any time through the corners. I've no doubt that you could take on actual race cars under the right circumstances with this thing, of course Group 4, but potentially even Group 3 on the right track. Take it on Le Mans, for example, and of course you're going to have a straight line advantage, and the cornering is more than good enough to worry any of the other supercars in the game. I would say that this month and last month have been two fantastic additions in the way of this Ford and also the Roof CTR3. For me personally, I love them both. They're both very cool, very obvious additions to the game in the case of the Ford, very unexpected in the case of the Roof, but both great. So ultimately a review like this is actually simpler than you might think. it's a great car, and there's not really much else to say about it. In fact, the only qualm that I have about the car is that in its fully tuned form, which is in this particular event running over 800 horsepower, the brakes don't necessarily feel that great. But at the same time, that's not surprising for GT Sport, because in a similar way to Gran Turismo 5, of course we cannot fit racing brakes, which is a strange thing, but at the same time, of course the car's not going to have great brakes if you can upgrade them. It's still running the stock brakes, and although they're great for 650 horsepower, slowing down 800 horsepower is a very different thing. In terms of using the car, well, it's fairly simple. You need to treat the car with respect, and the car will reciprocate. If you use this in a nonchalant kind of way, throwing it into corners like an Integra, well then of course you're going to go straight off the track. But if you treat it as it should be, and imagine that this really is the modern day interpretation of a GT40, well, you're not going to throw a Ford GT40 into a corner like it's a hot hatch. You have respect for the car, and you use it in the way that it needs to be used, which is smooth and fast. This is exactly the same. If you give the car that respect, and maybe don't necessarily try and slam on the throttle and slam on the brakes and chuck it into a corner, but try to make everything more of a flowing line, you'll find that it's a very fast, very capable car. And even though what I just said makes it sound like a temperamental kind of drama queen or a diva of a car, it really isn't. In fact, this makes stuff like the LaFerrari look even worse, because cars like that are so temperamental and so twitchy that the Ford feels great compared to those. This is easily more impressive than the Vulcan for what it is. It's easier to drive than the LaFerrari. Of course, it's far more nimble than a Veyron, and even compared to something like a Nissan GTR, which of course does, as I've said before, a lot of the work for you and has endless grip. Even compared to that, I think that the biggest advantage that this Ford has is that it has handling which borders right between being challenging and good. The Nissan is too good and not challenging enough, which allows you to just rely on the car rather than pushing the car out of its limits. And then you have others like the LaFerrari, which you're constantly fighting against the car to kind of bring it under check and keep it in control, and that can be just as much of a hindrance. This falls in between. It's a challenging car to get perfect, but it also doesn't demand too much of you. Ultimately, I am, of course, over the moon to see this car in the game. I do love this generation of the Ford GT. I think I do like it more than the 2000s one, actually, even though that is a fantastic car in its own right. As I said, I was talking about this vehicle for ages in terms of being such an obvious choice to bring to the game, and I'm glad that they have. Of course, this will be carried over into GT7, it goes without saying, and I know that many of you are also keen now to see, will we see some maybe GTE-style racing versions as well, either a fictional Group 3 machine or maybe a real Group 3 machine. I would be keen to see that, because based on how good this one is, it would be very cool to see that showing up in FIA events, and also just to use yourself. So yeah, I'd be on board for that. Although, to be transparent about it, my first love will always be a road car over a race car. So ultimately, I do love this machine. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Do you find it challenging? Are you happy with it? I certainly am. And the brakes, as I said, were the only slight qualm that I have about it. But, of course, stick around on the channel for reviews of the other cars. Yes, I will be tuning all of them as well. I guess the people who keep asking that probably aren't familiar with the channel, because that's the way it always works. But, until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.